Wallis Simpson, scheming seductress or history's most ill-judged woman.
I don't remember any love affairs like that anyone would know about. Keep your love affairs secret.
She was accused of being a whore and a harlot, a Nazi and a gold digger.
Twice divorced and once Britain's biggest hate figure, forever portrayed as the woman who made the king give up his crown.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
80 years later, she still bears this unfortunate reputation of the woman responsible for the abdication, when the truth is very far from that.
Shunned, shamed, and forced to live in exile with her husband.
She did her best to perpetuate the myth of the greatest love story of the 20th century.
But who was the real Wallis? To understand the woman at the heart of Britain's biggest constitutional crisis, you have to go back to her early life.
He wanted to control what she did with her time, who she met, what clothes she wore.
And to her 2 failed marriages.
Wallis rushed headlong into this relationship and then discovered on her honeymoon that she'd made a terrible mistake.
To understand why she even tried to escape the fateful relationship with the man who would be king.
Edward responded by saying that if she tried to leave him, he would slit his throat.
Through rarely seen photographs and archive footage, this is the story of a woman written off by the world.
She is a Chinese whisper campaign that should be looked at again.
Buried beneath the rumours is Wallis the most wronged woman of the last century.
I'd almost go so far as to say there ought to be a public apology to the Duchess of Windsor.
December the 10th, 1936, one of the most momentous days in the history of England. On this day, the decision of King Edward VIII was awaited with anxiety throughout the empire.
Just 10 months into his reign, King Edward VIII gave up the throne to be with Wallis Simpson, a divorced American socialite.
I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.
Obviously, the abdication was a seismic shock, not only to the royal family, but to the entire country.
Immediately, the object of Edward's affection became the focal point of hysteria and hatred.
She was blamed for the abdication. People believed that it was because of her that we lost this handsome, charming prince.
The world mocked their marriage and their love and said, actually, they didn't really love each other.
But the truth was different. The pair remained together despite the scandal until Edward's death in 1972.
They had both sacrificed so much. She'd sacrificed her entire reputation the world over for this marriage, and he'd given up his kingdom for her. And then it became the two of us against the world.
The romance of the two of them, of Wallis and Edward, has been so damaged in a way.
Edward, known to those closest to him as David, had a love for Wallis that endured, despite their many challenges. But what do we really know of Wallis beyond rumour and assumption? And how did her early years and her relationships with men define the events to come? Wallis Simpson was born Bessie Wallace Warfield in Pennsylvania on the 19th of June, 1896.
She came from a very good family in Baltimore, the Warfields, so she had a very good lineage.
Wallis faced struggles from an early age. When she was just 5 months old, her father Teakle died of tuberculosis.
From the moment that Wallis's mother became a single mother, finance became a very real issue. She lived with her Uncle Sol. At one point, she lived with her Aunt Bessie. She lived with her grandmother. Her mother rented somewhere for them. There was never the sense of her having a home.
Wallis had a difficult relationship with her wealthy Uncle Sol, utterly reliant on his money and his moods.
He was very cold, quite controlling. Wallis was rather afraid of him.
She was totally dependent on the charity of the Warfields, and this was hit and miss.
By age 16, Wallis had persuaded her Uncle Sol to send her to the prestigious boarding school Oldfields. The bright, witty Wallis always aspired to stand out and to better herself.
Wallis was always wearing the latest in fashions.
She said later in her life that she realised she wasn't the prettiest girl in the room, and that she realised that where she could stand apart was to be impeccable in her clothes.
What you see there is somebody who's determined to make an entrance into a room.
She became quite ambitious. She felt that she had to get on in life, and first opportunity she fled from Baltimore, created a new life for herself elsewhere.
After leaving school, Wallis pursued what she always craved: security and stability. In her mind, that meant she needed a man.
For a modern, bright woman like Wallis, it says so much about the time that for her, really, all that mattered was getting married.
In those days, the number of careers that were available for women were dramatically smaller than they are now, so she didn't have a lot of options.
When her cousin Corinne invited her to go to Pensacola in Florida, the naval base where her husband was, Wallis jumped at the opportunity. She was only 19, but it was there that she met a handsome young aviator, Win Spencer.
Win Earl Spencer was the son of a stockbroker, and he was somebody who was seen as glamorous, he was wealthy, he was somebody who was very attractive.
Earl Winfield Spencer, known as Win, was 8 years older than Wallis, then just 19. The relationship progressed rapidly.
I think she rushed into it to get away from her family and get another rung on the ladder of life.
Win appeared to be a man who could protect and provide for Wallis. Within just 5 months, they were engaged.
It was a sort of society wedding as far as Baltimore was concerned. It was reported in all the papers.
After the death of her father and her time with her controlling uncle, was Wallis driven by wealth or craving a sense of belonging?
You can see the idea of somebody who has these incredibly high goals, a great sense of self, a great sense of status, but also how she's going to achieve those goals.
Yet Win was not all that he seemed. Quickly, cracks appeared in the relationship.
Wallis rushed headlong into this relationship and then discovered on her honeymoon that she'd made a terrible mistake. Her new husband was an alcoholic, and devastatingly for Wallis, he would get very cruel and abusive when he was drunk. He got very jealous. It was an absolute nightmare for her.
After enduring 5 years of unhappiness, Wallis took a groundbreaking step, announcing to her family that she wanted a divorce.
That, of course, was something which people did not on the whole do in those days, not young ladies of her position in life.
Both her uncle and her mother were absolutely furious, and they would not show her any sympathy. The line in those days was, you'd bring shame on the Warfield family if you get divorced. Nobody in the Warfield family has ever had a divorce.
Wallis was trapped with a man she didn't want to be with, and by a family who refused to let her leave. In 1924, in what she described her Lotus year, she escaped to Shanghai.
Of course, in the days before jet travel, for a woman to shuttle between Shanghai and Peking, as it was then, present-day Beijing, was unusual.
And it was a very lively world. Shanghai had a particularly high reputation for fun lifestyle.
It was during her time in China that Wallis is rumoured to have had relationships with various distinguished men.
Wallis's technique was actually to read up about a man she was due to meet. She would read up everything that they'd done in advance, and it made many men feel that actually they were the centre of the world.
Aged 29, Wallis returned to the US and after 11 years finally got a divorce from Win. Once again, Wallis looked for security elsewhere.
She established residency in Warrenton, and while she was there, she met this handsome, tall, blue-eyed Anglo-American married man called Ernest Simpson.
Ernest was in charge of the shipbroking office in the City of London. Rather than having the low salary of a military officer, he was a businessman.
I think the number one thing Wallis saw was security. Wallis was really worried about how she was going to make ends meet. She'd seen how her mother had suffered.
She wrote to her Aunt Bessie, to whom she was very close, "I like him and he will be kind, which makes such a difference."
Ernest Simpson left his wife and young daughter to be with Wallis.
I think it's easy to see why Ernest was attracted to Wallis. She was such fun. She was the life and soul of a party. Ernest was completely blown away by Wallis.
Aged 32, Wallis moved to London to be with Ernest, and they married in Chelsea Registry Office. Now, with everything she longed for, she threw herself into London life.
She had been drifting for quite a long time up to that point. She began to entertain and she began to learn the ways of London society.
They moved into a beautiful flat in Marble Arch. Her apartment was decorated beautifully, and she made great play that she was a different sort of hostess.
One satisfied guest said Wallis's parties have so much pep, nobody ever wants to leave.
Wallis had created an apparently stable life for herself with Ernest, but it wasn't long before everything changed.
Suddenly, the introduction of Edward into their lives, his kind of dazzling orbit, actually uprooted all her security. From then on, things were never going to be the same again.
After moving to London with her husband Ernest in 1928, Wallis Simpson had grand ambitions, which involved the heir to the throne.
Edward had the reputation of being someone who enjoyed parties and loved the high life. She once wrote to her Aunt Bessie that she really wanted to meet him.
Did Wallis set out to seduce the future king, or was she simply determined to improve her social standing?
Wallis always hoped that she would bump into Edward. Not necessarily because she wanted to have an affair with him. I think at this point, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Wallis was just trying to move up the social ladder.
I think everybody wanted to meet the prince, and Wallis was no different. If Diana was the people's princess, then Edward was the people's prince. He was adored the world over. He was good-looking, he was charismatic.
Wallis befriended Thelma Furness, Edward's mistress at the time. It led to the moment that changed her life and the future of British history.
Wallis and Ernest were invited to Melton Mowbray for a weekend to act as a chaperone. That was very necessary in society, so that, all the right superficial actions were conformed to, and then Edward could actually have his way with Thelma.
Wallis made a big impression on the young prince, unfazed by his royal status.
She'd overheard him say to some of his courtiers, so really don't all the women look ghastly in this light? And then when Wallis was introduced and he said to her, "Oh, madam, may I say how absolutely lovely you look tonight?" because they'd already met. Wallis, quick as a flash, snapped back, "Oh, but sir, I thought you said all the women were looking ghastly in this light." He was smitten from that first moment.
He liked dominant women and he liked people to stand up to him, and that sort of fired him up. So it wasn't long after that before he was coming round for drinks regularly in their London flat, the Simpsons' London flat, and then dinner parties.
His kind of dazzling orbit actually uprooted all her security and sent her life on a very different course.
Both Wallis and Ernest quickly became absorbed into the prince's royal world.
To be in that milieu was very exciting for her, and Ernest enjoyed that very much too, and in fact benefited from the social connections with his business.
was a kind of a very racy scene. The jazz clubs and sort of people playing the piano late at night and cocktails.
Edward offered Wallis acceptance and a passport to an intoxicating lifestyle. She would later describe Edward as an open sesame to a new and glittering world.
She did write to her Aunt Bessie to say she thought it was almost too good to be true.
So what was it about Wallis Simpson that meant the prince was so desperate to be in her company?
Edward at this point loved everything American. What he really liked was American society and American women, and he liked married American women.
She was very well educated. She was far brighter than the Duke and better read. And the people that I spoke to who met them both said you prayed to be seated next to Wallis at a dinner party because she was fun and lively and the ball always came back over the net.
Though Wallis had become further ingrained into Edward's life, he was still in a relationship with Thelma. And Wallis, of course, was with Ernest.
Then there was a critical moment when Thelma had to go away. So she invited Wallis to, and this is the famous quote, look after the little man.
Edward was infatuated, and he doted upon her.
She was given a style of living which you could never have imagined she'd have otherwise. She was given jewellery, she was given foreign holidays, she was given amazing clothing.
For a woman who had seen her dreams snatched away before, this was beyond anything she could have imagined, and all without consequence. Or so it seemed.
As his obsession with her strengthened, their lives became more entwined. He threw a 37th birthday party for her, and what she didn't realise was how she was never going to be able to extricate herself from this.
According to Wallis herself, friendship turned to romance in the summer of 1934, during a holiday where Ernest was absent.
Wallis herself would later write in her memoirs, we had crossed the indefinable boundary which existed between friendship and love.
At the beginning, Ernest was very complicit in her relationship with the Prince of Wales. As Freda Dudley Ward's husband, who was a previous mistress of the Prince of Wales, said, no one ever minds if their wife is having an affair with the Prince of Wales. So in those circles, it was considered very chic and almost a sort of accolade.
And Ernest himself was somebody who, after a very short amount of time, he had his own love affairs and things like that.
In the English upper classes, and especially the royal family, it was completely normal for these affairs to take place. She wrote to her Aunt Bessie saying, what a bump I'll get when the prince drops me for some English beauty. Luckily, I'm prepared. Well, the real tragedy for her was she could never have been prepared for what happened to her and the prince's steadfast refusal ever to give her up.
After unreliable relationships with some of the men in her earlier life, Edward's devotion may have come as a surprise. Although the relationship was not yet in the public eye, it was already causing consternation within the royal family.
They would have seen her as a brash American, with already one divorce behind her and married somebody else.
In an Anglican country where divorcees were still banned from Ascot's royal enclosure, Wallis's marital status caused alarm. Edward was questioned by his father, but insisted Wallis was not his mistress.
In 1935, George V remarked to the new Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, that after I'm dead, within 12 months, Edward will come to ruination if he carries on.
Wallis Simpson was a woman under suspicion. She was even considered a threat to national security, put under surveillance and smeared with scandalous rumours.
I think both the government and the royal family were really rather terrified about what they didn't know concerning Wallis Simpson. They were trying to find out something that would enable them to shame her and end the relationship.
The warning signs were there for Wallis Simpson. The lies and the rumours were growing, and she was making powerful enemies. But perhaps it was her life before Edward which made her ignore them. And yet not even she could have predicted how far he would go for the woman he loved.
He became obsessed. It was a total obsession.
On the 20th of January 1936, King George V died. Edward, Prince of Wales, would become King Edward VIII, ruler of the United Kingdom and the British Empire, and Emperor of India.
From the moment King George V died and Edward became king, the situation became much more serious. I mean, it simply wasn't an option in 1936 in Britain for the king to have a divorced wife.
The official announcement of Edward becoming king was overshadowed for those within the royal circle, as he watched with a still married Mrs. Simpson.
The tradition, for whatever reason, there is no logic to it, is that the new monarch did not observe his or her proclamation. So it was a breach of tradition, and it was the kind of thing that was observed as being provocative. It was a way of getting Edward's new reign off to a bad start, and also casting his relationship with Wallis in a bad light.
The royal family, along with the government, were increasingly alarmed at Edward's seeming lack of commitment to his new role.
Edward, as Prince of Wales, was never very keen on royal duties. But once he becomes king, it is expected that he will devote time and effort to fulfilling his royal responsibilities. Instead, Edward spends most of his time planning parties, enjoying life, carrying on as before.
Wallis was blamed for Edward's distracted behaviour, and one member of staff reported that he followed her around like a dog.
The court, by which I mean the aristocrats, the courtiers, the aides, those people who were advising Edward and who had advised King George V, were horrified by Wallis's influence on Edward.
He had a great ambivalence about being king, and in a way, Wallis presented the perfect way out for him.
Wallis had given no thought to being Edward's wife, despite the status and wealth it potentially offered.
I think Wallis always believed that once he became king, it would be quite plain that she would be dismissed, because that's what happened to royal mistresses throughout time. And Wallis never really wanted to be queen because she didn't want all the hard work.
And she felt, in fact, when he became king, as he got busier and busier, that this would be the perfect excuse for their relationship to end, because surely now he would have to find a suitable bride, a worthy bride.
But he became obsessed. It was a total obsession. She was his obsession and remained his obsession all his life.
Wallis's husband, Ernest, knew the situation couldn't continue, and over dinner confronted Edward.
While Mrs. Simpson was married to Mr. Simpson, nobody was really particularly alarmed about it, because there was absolutely no question of her marrying the king.
The meeting would change that.
He went to dinner with Edward and he said, "Are you going to do the decent thing?" He was almost like a paternal figure who was protective of Wallis, saying to the future king, "What are you going to do for my wife?" And Edward said to him, "Rest assured, I shall marry her."
Ernest agreed they'd divorce, making way for the king. Wallis was reportedly unhappy that he was ready to give her up, her future yet again being decided by men. But Edward was increasingly open about his love for her, and that summer it became public knowledge.
He spends the summer of 1936 on the luxury yacht Narlin, traipsing around Europe, having an extended vacation with Wallis.
It was an extraordinarily bold thing they did, because they'd be wandering around in front of tens of thousands of people, and they'd be holding hands and quite obviously affectionate towards each other.
the world's media latch on to this story and the intimacy between the new king and this married woman and have a field day.
Somebody got a long lens shot. Again, another moment of absolute change when Wallis's hand was seen resting on Edward's forearm, just for a second. But it only takes a second for the click of a camera to get that moment.
Only the British press, out of deference to the king, stayed silent. It wasn't until Wallis was in Paris at the end of the holiday that she realised the scandal they'd unleashed.
Her Aunt Bessie sent her a packet of clippings from American magazines in which various photographs of Wallis and the king had been published.
She reads the American newspapers and the foreign media and begins to get a sense of just how unpopular and disliked she was.
Wallis wrote to Edward telling him their relationship had to end.
I know Ernest and have the deepest affection and respect for him. I feel I'm better with him than with you. And I am sure you and I would only create disaster together. And that letter is such a significant cry from the heart saying, let me go. Give me back my freedom.
And Edward responded by saying that if she tried to leave him, not only would he follow her to the ends of the earth until he found her, but more seriously, if he didn't, he couldn't possibly live without her. He would slit his throat. I think it's at this point that Wallis realised she was trapped, albeit by a trap of her own making.
The royal family were appalled by Wallis, but took comfort in the belief that she wasn't free to marry the king. Then, in October, she was granted a divorce, a decree nisi in the courts.
The horrific moment came when it was publicly known that Wallis was trying to divorce Ernest. Suddenly, the horrific possibility of Wallis and Edward getting married was there for the government to get worried about.
The government view was Queen Wallis was absolutely unacceptable. She was unacceptable because she would be a divorced woman with 2 husbands living.
The church, the royal family and the government said they could not accept Wallis as queen. But Edward said he could not live without her.
Wallis dominated Edward in every significant respect except one. He would not give her up. So when it was finally clear that Edward was determined to marry her and was willing to abdicate, to give up the throne, she knew that this was a wrong choice, but she knew she could not change Edward's decision.
In desperation, she wrote to Ernest, saying that she wanted to leave England and not return until after Edward's coronation.
I think Wallis believed perhaps she could, even at this very late stage, go away. Perhaps even now she could go to China, but the situation had got out of control. It simply was no longer possible for her to get away.
On December the 3rd, the press blackout ended and the crisis dominated the headlines.
When the news finally hit the stands, it was the most seismic shock to the country. I think that the majority of the British public felt betrayed.
But it was Wallis who was the target of an angry public.
Wallis was accused of everything. She was accused of being a whore and a harlot, a Nazi and a gold digger. Wallis received poison pen letters and bomb threats.
She was living in the Regent's Park in Cumberland Terrace. People started throwing stones through her window. She got really scared.
She believed that every flashbulb was somebody with a gun who might actually try and assassinate her. And Baldwin also believed that there might be an assassination attempt against her. So it was decided that they had to get Wallis out of the country.
Wallis fled to the south of France. Compared to her early life, she'd been living her dream, only for it to become a nightmare.
She had to climb out of lavatory windows, she had to lie on the back seats of cars with blankets thrown over her. One of her friends said she left England like a fugitive in a chain gang.
Wallis was shocked and Wallis was angry at the way she was portrayed in the British press. She did not believe that she was responsible for all this.
In England, the government would still not agree to the marriage. Edward saw no option but to abdicate.
Nobody could believe that he was really going to do this. And even his last dinner at Royal Lodge with Queen Mary and his siblings, you get the sense that they were all just engulfed in this kind of shock. They could not believe what was happening.
Wallis was about to become forever known as the woman who made a king give up his crown.
She would have realised that the world was judging her and that she had become pretty much the most hated woman in the world.
In hiding in France, Wallis made one final attempt to dissuade Edward VIII from giving up his throne.
Wallis put out this statement saying that she would withdraw from any marriage. And this, for a while, was thought to have actually solved the problem, but it didn't work.
On December the 11th at 10 p.m, King Edward VIII broadcast to the nation on the BBC.
A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
She listened to the abdication speech, which I guess was when it really became obvious that the whole thing was completely final and done and dusted.
I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.
She was cowering under a rug and crying and saying, this must not be allowed to happen, this should never have happened. She was absolutely horrified.
And rather than thinking how romantic, she wrote in her memoirs later that that night I drank the dregs of my defeat. And you can't think that anyone saying that was doing something because they were deeply in love and finally their beloved king has given up the throne to be with them.
Wallis had never wanted Edward to give up his crown, but by abdicating, the king had determined her future as well as his, to be condemned and shunned by the society she had tried so hard to belong to.
There's no doubt she was trapped. Any implication or suggestion that she wanted to be queen and she wanted to marry Edward is simply factually incorrect.
Yet Wallis found herself unable to walk away.
Behind this facade, this iconic, glamorous woman was insecure, unstable, and desperately afraid of being left penniless and all alone. Her only identity was linked to who she married, her status in society.
And so she became the woman who stole the king, this evil woman who'd taken their beloved king away.
Finally free to marry, Edward, now Duke of Windsor, joined her in France, as the new reluctant king made his disapproval known.
The wedding was, of course, overshadowed by the news that Edward had received the night before that Wallis was not going to get the HRH title. And he literally received this news like a fatal gunshot wound from which he never recovered.
by not making Wallis a royal duchess, she would not be curtsied to. And as far as Edward was concerned, this was such a deep humiliation, such an unnecessary insult, that he was not going to bring his wife back to England only to see her insulted. So effectively, as long as Wallis did not have royal initials, HRH, they were effectively exiled.
Not a single member of the royal family attended the wedding.
And so it was a terrible moment for the Duke of Windsor when he realised that none of his family, not one of them, were going to come out and be present at the wedding. So it became a very kind of low-key affair.
It was incredibly difficult for Wallis because she became this man's whole existence. And she said on her honeymoon, on the first morning when she woke up, that he was standing by her bed looking over her as if to say, and what do we do now? And here's a man who'd been used to his red boxes, a schedule, an itinerary. He was one of the most powerful men in the world, and suddenly it was the two of us.
The abdication left Wallis and Edward cut off from their social circles and his political advisors. Edward had retained ties with Germany, and in 1937 he accepted an invitation to meet with Hitler.
There's a big crowd at the station to catch a glimpse of His Royal Highness and the Duchess on their arrival from Paris. Hi-hos echo in their ears as they drive away to their hotel.
The declared purpose of the trip was to study working conditions.
The Duke begins his tour of inspection of industrial conditions with a visit to a suburban factory.
But there was another motive.
The reason that he went was he said to them, will you treat my wife as a member of the royal family? Will you curtsy to her? Will you address her as HRH? He wanted Wallis to experience the pomp and pageantry of a royal foreign tour.
At a time when most people could see that the likelihood of international conflict was extremely high, it was an act of colossal folly and colossal vanity.
There's a terrible photograph showing Wallis smiling and curtsying to Hitler, a photograph that quite rightly came back to haunt them.
This, of course, does not go down well with the royal family and the British public.
Viewed as Nazi sympathisers, the British government wanted them banished. So Edward was made British governor of the Bahamas.
Edward was absolutely appalled at a reception when they arrived in the Bahamas because the host got up and made a speech and said how wonderful it was to welcome the Duke of Windsor. And in his opening speech, he did not make reference to the Duchess. And Edward was furious and made this incredibly plain. And it was excruciating for all the guests present.
The Bahamas held few attractions for Wallis, but just as she had done in her life before Edward, she tried to make the best of it.
She was a very good governor's wife, and she got involved with the local Red Cross, and she was very effective.
The Windsors remained in the Bahamas until the end of the war, but there were to be no more official roles. On a rare trip to England after the war, Edward implored his family to meet Wallis. But it didn't happen, and nor did it after the death of King George VI in 1952.
The Queen Mother, it was well known, always blamed Wallis for imposing the burdens of kingship on her husband, and by implication, perhaps hastening his death because of the sheer burden of ruling the country through the Second World War.
Unwelcome in England, Wallis and Edward settled in Paris, filling their time with society dinners and trips abroad.
She tried to create a sort of mini kingdom of style in Paris. She tried to entertain. She tried to do things to please Edward, but I think that she was not happy.
She would have realised that the world was judging her and that she had become pretty much the most hated woman in the world, and the only way to redeem that, really, was to try to make the Duke of Windsor happy.
It would be decades later, and in the most tragic of circumstances, that the royal family would offer Wallis some kind of acceptance. In 1967, she and Edward were invited to the unveiling of a memorial to his mother, Queen Mary. 5 years later, as the Duke was dying of cancer, the Queen made her first and only visit to the couple's French home.
It was, they emphasised, a purely social visit. The Queen would like to see her uncle and his wife, especially as it was known for some time that he was not very well.
It was a small step of the kind of familial recognition that he had always craved for, but had rarely received.
This in itself was an historic moment. The first time the woman for whom King Edward VIII gave up the throne of England has been hostess to her niece by marriage, Queen Elizabeth.
10 days later, Edward died. Wallis returned to England for his funeral.
It was the trooping of the colour the day before his funeral, which was also their 35th wedding anniversary. And astonishingly, Wallis was asked, would she like to attend the trooping of the colour in a carriage with the Queen Mother, who had been so viciously beastly to her all these years. And to Wallis's credit, she said no. Everything that happened to her then, staying at Buckingham Palace, it being recorded in the court circular, the royal family accepting her, for her, it was too little, too late.
Edward gave up the crown for Wallis, but she gave up her reputation for him, and now she was alone.
She then watched out of the window as all the troops and the royal family came back to the palace.
The next day, she did join the royal family, as Edward was laid to rest.
On top of the coffin there was no crown, but a wreath from the Duchess of Windsor. The service lasted half an hour. Then with the Queen, the Duchess of Windsor left the chapel.
She wore a very elegant black chiffon veil covering her face, and she was miserable, and she was really worried about what her future would be.
And after that service, the Duchess left immediately for her home in Paris.
The grief that she experienced post his death was quadrupled by the fact that she had no relations, nobody in the royal family liked her or was going to be kind to her. She was utterly bereft.
Up until that point, she was doing everything possible to keep the show on the road for him, and after that, she didn't have to do that anymore, and she wasn't really well enough to do it anymore, so she kind of gave up.
Wallis survived Edward by 14 years, but they were long, lonely years, and her health had deteriorated.
And she eventually ended up on a life support machine and basically lay for 10 years on a bed while things disappeared from the house, and the whole situation was absolutely terrible.
She became a prisoner in her own home. Nobody was allowed in. It was the most terrible, devastating act. And she died alone, emaciated, a prisoner in her own home.
After her death in 1986, her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, attended by the royal family.
I remember one of her friends who was there in the chapel, as I was too, actually. This friend of hers said, what was done for the Duchess of Windsor that day was everything the Duke could have possibly wanted. The coffin in the middle of the choir of St. George's Chapel, the beautiful singing, the candlelight, all the royal family around. If he did look down on it, he would have been very impressed by the scene.
She was buried next to the Duke of Windsor in the grounds of Frogmore House.
I see Wallis's life as really rather sad because she had to depend on men, and she was blamed for the abdication, for a constitutional crisis, when actually it was Edward, it was the king, who was the one hunting her, who was so desperate to have her by his side.
There's no question she did not want to marry him. She did not want to force him from the throne, and she very much wanted him to remain as King of England.
In Edward, Wallis had found a man who loved her completely, but she paid a high price, becoming one of history's most vilified women.
Charles and Camilla, our new King and Queen.
It's an absolute miracle.
After years of waiting, finally crowned in a ceremony watched by millions across the globe.
It hasn't been easy for Charles and Camilla, but here we are, coronation.
But there was a time when this was unthinkable.
She's not just the second wife. She is the other woman who was around when the first wife was around.
The royal couple have weathered many storms, overcoming obstacles and disapproval along the way.
The Prince of Wales has admitted publicly for the first time that he was unfaithful.
People really did begin to discuss whether he was fit to be king, whether the monarchy at large was in danger.
From the press,
some might have even said Camilla's now the most hated woman on the planet.
From the public,
the level of anger was something we haven't seen in this country for a long time.
And within their own family.
Harry in his book says they pleaded with Charles to be with Camilla but not to marry.
So how has the new King and Queen's relationship survived so much scrutiny?
I think it just shows how much she loves Charles, that she's prepared to do all of this to support him.
And how has their love endured despite a lifetime of difficulties?
Charles said that Camilla was absolutely non-negotiable, and he's stuck to that.
Charles and Camilla is the triumph of love over circumstance. The relationship has flourished against all odds.
It's been a long and bumpy road for the British public to accept that both Charles and Camilla could become King and Queen of the country and the Commonwealth.
They have weathered so much public trash talking, so much gossip, so much bad press, not only from the actual media, but from their own relatives.
But it was Queen Elizabeth II herself who, in the last few months of her life, gave her daughter-in-law a clear stamp of approval.
I think the Queen was a very forgiving and understanding person. And she needed time, like all of us did. And Camilla let the public and the Queen have that time.
In a message to the Commonwealth, Queen Elizabeth wrote that it was her wish that Camilla should be our Queen. She had accepted her, and now, so should we.
She wanted to step in to clarify Camilla's role because she knew that everybody else, including all of the British media and the rest of the royal family, would be asking themselves, oh my God, what do we call Camilla? Queen, girlfriend, consort, mistress? You can't do that. So the Queen said, I know what we'll do. She'll be Queen Consort, and you'll be happy with that.
When Charles and Camilla married, it was announced that she would be known as Princess Consort, and I think that everybody thought that that would be exactly what she would be called. And then, of course, we had that unprecedented statement out of the blue for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee that the late Queen said it was her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort. And even that is a huge, huge shift from the days that Camilla was public enemy number one.
With the Queen's blessing, Charles and Camilla have finally earned their right to the throne. Just a few months later, Queen Elizabeth II passed away, and the new king led the mourning with the new Queen, Camilla, at his side. She was there to provide public comfort and support, as she had been doing in private for decades.
Camilla was extremely supportive of Prince Charles following the Queen's death. She was his rock.
And when the stress of his mother's death and his new responsibilities got too much for Charles,
oh God, I hate this.
She was a soothing influence.
I think Camilla's role after the death of the late Queen was crucial. We saw that. There were little glimpses in public, for example, calming him down when the pen exploded and he was complaining about that when he was signing a document in the immediate aftermath. It's noticeable. He is happier, calmer, more relaxed when Camilla is around.
They are fantastically well matched and very, very suited together, and I think they really do complement each other.
She grounds him, she tells him when he's being too grand.
But it hasn't always been this way. Camilla hasn't always been welcomed this warmly by the public or indeed the royal family.
The British public adored Diana. They thought she was the wronged victim, sacrificed on the stuffy altar of Buckingham Palace. This kind of, virginal maiden who had been married off to Charles, produced these sons, and then she was abandoned when Charles started up his affair with Camilla. That was the narrative.
For decades after Princess Diana's death, Camilla's name was mud.
In the 1970s, the newly invested Prince of Wales was the world's most eligible bachelor. With a seemingly endless stream of beautiful women on his arm, Prince Charles could have his pick of society beauties, so long as they met a certain criteria.
I don't think Charles wanted to settle down necessarily. He still wanted to see the world, to have a life before getting married. He was already Prince of Wales, figuring out what that meant to him, preparing himself for kingship. He never knew how long he would have to wait, of course, but he certainly had other things in mind than settling down and getting married.
It seems absolutely incomprehensible that at the beginning of the 1980s, Charles had to marry a virgin, and that Charles had to marry someone who was the right faith as well. He couldn't marry a Catholic, he had to marry a Protestant. For us now, it's only 40 years on, but it seems absolutely inconceivable that he had to abide by those rules.
One sporty debutante caught his eye. Camilla Shand was a party girl, terrific fun, and with a love of horses.
Charles and Camilla met at a polo match at Windsor Great Park, a royal park. It's said that Camilla came up to the Prince of Wales and said, "Oh, we have something in common."
The two families already shared some history.
Camilla's great-grandmother was Alice Keppel, and she was a mistress of King Edward VII, and it's said that she was his favorite mistress.
And soon Charles was absolutely smitten.
Camilla was sociable. She had boyfriends. She had lots of men interested in her. She was sporty. She had her own personality. Yeah, I think it was love at first sight.
Yeah, he was in love with Camilla. Oh, he was totally in love with Camilla.
But the royal family did not necessarily see her as queen material.
The old days of having to marry a European princess were over, but it had to be somebody of unimpeachable virtue.
Camilla was racy and fun and very popular. Exactly what makes the ideal girlfriend, but exactly what makes the wrong kind of wife.
Their romance was about to hit the rocks with family intervention from both sides, which would change the course of history and lead to a devastating series of events.
He's been told that this woman who he loves is not suitable. He can't marry her.
It's the late 70s, and the new Prince of Wales is enjoying his role as one of the world's most eligible men.
Prince Charles was a huge catch. He's in line to the throne. He's going to be king. He's got proper blue-blooded pedigree. He had a great figure, and he looks good in his tweeds, so there's a certain sporty attractiveness there.
He was a particularly shy young man, and yet he had the world at his feet. He was absolutely adored by huge sections of society.
But the palace is becoming increasingly concerned that he's rather too taken with the fun-loving Camilla Shand.
Charles and Camilla Shand, as she then was, knew each other in the late 60s, early 70s London scene. Lots of shared friends, groups of friends that were sort of overlapping. And they were an item then, on and off.
Charles and Camilla were friends first and foremost. They had a love of horses, the countryside. They met at a polo match. They mixed in the same circles. And yet their love affair was pretty doomed from the start.
It seems inconceivable that in the late 1970s you couldn't marry the person that you wanted to marry. But there are a number of issues. Camilla, whilst her family were, high-born, they weren't aristocracy, they weren't dukes and duchesses.
They saw her as a party girl, someone who had, quite unkindly had multiple partners, that there was certain baggage that came with her. And yet Charles saw a completely different side to her. He saw her as someone who was very affectionate, very honest, and I think from his side, he saw that as a particular problem, that he didn't have affection and honesty from within his own family.
His great-uncle and mentor, Lord Mountbatten, wielded great influence on the prince.
Charles was extremely close to Lord Mountbatten, and he's talked about how he was almost like a father figure to Charles. And Lord Mountbatten didn't approve of Camilla either. And Charles would have taken that on board and would have actually thought very hard then if she was the right person.
Lord Mountbatten counselled Charles against marrying Camilla because Camilla was the wrong sort of bride. She was the right sort of mistress. She was the right sort of girlfriend. She was enormous fun, and Charles had way too much fun with Camilla.
The problem with choosing a royal bride, certainly in a bygone age, was that it wasn't necessarily the choice of the man who would be marrying the woman. It was the institution at large was playing a huge part within it.
Prince Charles dithered when it came to proposing to Camilla because everyone around him was briefing against her. I think the rest of the royal family sat down and said to Charles, well, Camilla's fabulous, she's an excellent sport, but ask yourself, is she wifey material? And the answer to that is a solid no.
Conveniently for the royal family, Charles, who had begun his military service, was posted on board a naval ship heading for the Caribbean. Not one to be messed around, while Charles was away at sea, Camilla took up with the dashing army major, Andrew Parker Bowles.
Andrew swept her off her feet.
Charles was sent off for 8 months service to the Royal Navy, and in that 8 months, Camilla became engaged.
Camilla's father, apparently, Breshan, said to Andrew, "Go on, you've got to make an honest woman of her or not." And so Andrew Parker Bowles proposed to Camilla.
By the time he came back, Camilla Shand had become Camilla Parker Bowles.
It was a message to Charles, really, that Camilla's going to do her own thing and get on with her own life.
Charles, left literally all at sea, was kicking himself for what might have been.
He didn't propose, he dithered. She got engaged while he's doing his service for the Royal Navy. She's not on the table anymore.
There was Camilla, who was due to be married and for him, if you will. And so I think he found it quite difficult to decide what he wanted in those early years.
As the Prince of Wales passes his 30th birthday, the age he himself had said was the ideal time to get married, the pressure is growing on him to find himself a bride.
The royal family is saying to Prince Charles, we're auditioning for the role of Queen of England, so chop chop. There's pressure on Prince Charles to marry and marry right.
These were the pressures that he was under, and he was getting older and he needed a wife and heir.
While Charles continued to play the field, a shy teenager was waiting in the wings, about to take her place on the world stage.
Along comes young 18-year-old Lady Diana Spencer, whose sister, Lady Sarah Spencer, had briefly dated the then Prince of Wales. And in fact, Diana's sister, Sarah, is the one who set them up. You know, she claimed that she was Cupid.
The Spencer family knew the royal family very well, so Charles had dated one of Diana's big sisters.
He'd met Diana at Althorpe, which was the Spencer family seat, but he never sort of properly talked to her until his relationship with Lady Sarah was over. Mountbatten had been brutally murdered in Ireland. His boat infamously was blown up by the IRA. Charles was distraught. He was at a house party. There was a young Diana Spencer, aged 18. They're sitting on the hay bales together. They get talking. Diana is, we know she had great emotional intelligence. Diana is incredibly sympathetic at the loss of his uncle and someone who was, you know, real paterfamilias. And he thought, goodness, this girl's lovely. She really understands me, she gets me.
Diana was young. Diana came from the right family, an aristocratic background. It seemed like a match made, not in heaven, but a match made by the royal family.
Diana is young, she's beautiful, she's very attractive, she's lovely, she's sweet-natured. So that's what Charles sees in her.
Are you bearing up with it quite well, though? Because it must be quite a strain with all of us after you.
Well, it is, naturally.
Diana looks at Charles and sees promise for the future. She sees a package that she can get on board with. She's so innocent that she has nothing to judge it by.
Once news hit that Charles and Diana were dating, you know, we all just remember those photographs, Diana's sort of coy smile, but she became a huge hit everybody was hoping for. She looked the part and came from the right family.
Entranced by her girlish charm and with Diana ticking all of the right boxes, Charles was swift to propose.
Put yourself in his shoes. He's been told that this woman who he loves is not suitable. He can't marry her. And these are the criteria that need to be met. Someone who's a virgin, someone who's the right religion, someone who's very highborn. And to be fair to Charles, he found her. And he sacrificed his own personal happiness to the greater good of the crown.
Charles and Diana didn't really know one another. I mean, they knew of each other, but they didn't really know one another. I think they only really had a few meetings, a few dates before they got engaged. And until that point, apparently she was still calling him Sir.
And I suppose in love.
Of course.
Whatever in love means.
We've seen the infamous engagement interview talking about whatever love is, and everybody could see that here was two people who were not particularly well matched, and yet when you look at Charles and Camilla in today's world, they are fantastically well suited.
The public took Diana to their hearts and wedding fever swept the land.
Shy, she had been a nursery teacher, and yet here she was marrying a future king who was very, very different to her in so many ways. She was very sort of shy and retiring. We could see that even in their engagement interview. And I think the British public were kind of willing her to make a success of the role, because it's a pretty unforgiving place if you can't manage to make it work.
The world absolutely bought into this fairy tale of the prince and the princess, Charles and Diana. It's what we wanted. We wanted that storybook ending.
Our first sight of Lady Diana was as the glass coach left Clarence House.
The wedding was an amazing day. I mean, you know, what little girl doesn't want to think that they can grow up and be a princess? That dress was amazing. Yes, it was crumpled, but I mean, it was fantastic.
And then the dress.
Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor and keep her in sickness and in health, and forsaking all other, keep thee only unto her, so long as ye both shall live?
I will.
Bless, O Lord, this ring, and grant that he who gives it and she who shall wear it may remain faithful to each other, and abide in thy peace and favor, and live together in love until their lives end. Here is the stuff of which fairy tales are made. The prince and princess on their wedding day.
Every institution needs a very positive shot of PR, and what better than a glitzy marriage from the heir of the throne?
I pronounce that they be man and wife together.
I mean, you know, the British public were delighted. Here was this gorgeous young aristocrat, and she was gorgeous. Diana, you know, a member of the family that the royals had known for eons. Here was the dashing naval officer, Prince Charles, who'd finally found the love of his life. I mean, no one knew that behind the scenes, the pair of them had only met 12 times. It was the fairy tale writ large.
The day of the wedding was fantastic. I mean, we now know what Diana knew behind the scenes, but for us spectators, it was a fairy tale wedding. The Archbishop said it was a fairy tale wedding. We all believed it was a fairy tale wedding, and it's a shame that it wasn't. But the wedding day itself was fantastic.
What's the baby like? He's in marvellous form. Does the baby have any hair? He looks marvellous. Yes. Fair. Fair. Sort of blondish.
And there was further delight when, within a year of the wedding, Diana produced an heir, Prince William.
The royal family had never experienced this type of attention or popularity from anyone. The press became obsessed with Diana and this relationship.
With Harry arriving a few years later, they seemed a happy family. But all was not well in the House of Windsor.
Charles did love her, and there was attraction in the early days, and he did try to make it work. How long he tried to make it work is up for question, certainly, you know, when you read Diana's book. However, Camilla was always somewhere in the background, so, you know, was it given a chance to work? She hoped that the birth of Harry would bring them closer, and it didn't.
Diana sensed Charles's affections and attentions now lay elsewhere. Camilla was back on the scene.
Charles was totally in love with Camilla, but was told she was unsuitable. It's hard to fall out of love with somebody just because somebody is telling you that you can't marry that person. I think Charles tried very hard in the early part of his marriage to Diana to make it work, but it's hard to muffle love.
Camilla was no longer part of Charles's past. She was again firmly in the here and now. But no one could have predicted the part she would come to play in his future. It's 1981. Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles is supposedly in the past. He has a new wife, and the nation has a new sweetheart.
Diana was wildly popular at the time of her marriage to Charles. She was charming, charismatic, beautiful, intelligent, soft-spoken, classy.
Impossible to take a bad picture of Diana, and she was incredibly popular. It was the fairy tale wedding. You know, they were going to be the king and queen. It was a very optimistic and romantic time.
The royal family had never experienced this type of attention or popularity. The press became almost obsessed.
In the spring of 1983, the couple embark on their first foreign tour to Australia. Diana takes the country by storm. Charles is pushed into the background.
The cracks were certainly showing way before the tour of Australia, where Charles was looking at Diana and seeing that she was adored by the public, both at home and abroad, and she was becoming an absolute superstar.
I haven't yet worked out a method of splitting my wife in half.
And that moment in Australia, that's been well documented, where he really thought the attention and the spotlight should have been on him, and yet his bride and his wife was taking the limelight.
That really it would have been far easier to have had two wives, to have covered both sides of the street. And I could have walked down the middle, directing the operation.
Their royal tour is a huge success, but the royal relationship is already in trouble.
I mean, look, acres of print and newsreels have been talked about what went wrong in Charles and Diana's marriage. But I think the bottom line is that they were just absolutely chronically unsuited.
She is sociable, she's vivacious, she's relatable, she makes friends easily, she likes to go out. Charles, by contrast, likes watercolors, he likes books of history, he likes archaeology, he likes town planning, he likes nature, he likes conservation.
She wanted to go and watch musicals with Elton John. She wanted to go and watch the ballet, she wanted to go shopping. They had nothing in common.
There's one woman with whom Charles does have something in common. Like Charles, Camilla is married with 2 children, and she too is unhappy.
So Camilla had been swept off her feet by Andrew, the dashing Andrew Parker Bowles. They get married and they set up home in Wiltshire. But Andrew had his flat in London and was very quickly back to his London life. And his London life included sweeping other women off their feet. So Camilla was very, very lonely. She was at home, she was effectively a single mum looking after her kids, and quite quickly it became apparent that she would have to share her husband with a number of other women.
It wasn't long before rumours were rife that Charles and Camilla's loneliness had drawn them back together. Some argue that they'd never truly been apart.
Charles gifted Camilla a bracelet on the eve of his wedding to Diana. What is the significance of that gift? It's a gift saying, I'll always love you.
There are a lot of rumours about, how much Charles and Camilla were an item, unofficial item, in the late 70s, early 80s. I don't know, I wasn't there. Camilla was appointed to be Diana's chaperone for a lot of that period up to the wedding, which, now you look back on it, that's odd.
I believe this narrative that Charles and Camilla didn't start the relationship up again until Lady Susan Hussey, who was Charles's godmother, saw how absolutely devastated Charles was. He was on the floor, and Lady Susan Hussey rang Camilla and said, "You're the only person who can save him." And then Camilla got back in contact with Charles. Of course, friends of Diana would probably say that was, absolute rubbish, and they were seeing each other a lot earlier, but I think Camilla literally put him back on his feet.
They were photographed together on holiday, allegedly, in 1989 or so. If he's in love with her and she's in love with him, then that's that.
By the early 90s, the marriage is in crisis and the Waleses are at war.
So it was kind of tit for tat played out on this global stage. It's so public. We talk about Harry and Netflix and Spare, but you go back one generation and Charles and Diana were doing this, and it absolutely was catnip to the public, and it was hugely destructive to the monarchy.
Undertaking official trips together, Charles and Diana seem even further apart.
We start to see Diana suffering a little bit with unhappiness, and they weren't seen together that often unless they had to.
In June 1992, Andrew Morton's book lays bare the secret in a close friend, James Gilby.
The Sun newspaper got hold of it, and you could dial in to a premium rate number and hear James Gilby call Diana Squinch or Squidgy, and it was just them having romantic phone call, how much they loved each other, how much they wanted to see each other, wanted to squinch you. It's pretty toe-curling.
The couple's private unhappiness is now public knowledge.
You get to the sort of late 80s, early 90s, and it's kind of warfare in the press. It's obvious that Charles and Diana are not only not getting on, but are at complete loggerheads with each other.
The end of the marriage seems a matter of time.
So the Queen at that point stepped in and said, right, that's it. You've got to separate. We're going to announce an official separation, which they duly did.
It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate. Their Royal Highnesses have no plans to divorce, and their constitutional positions are unaffected. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh particularly hope that the intrusions into the privacy of the Prince and Princess may now cease.
It brings the curtain down on a miserable year for the Queen. Prince Andrew separated from his wife Sarah, Princess Anne separated from her husband Mark, and to cap it all, fire swept through Windsor Castle, causing millions of pounds worth of damage.
It is a scene of chaos and destruction. This castle, dating back to the 9th century and which survived the wartime Blitz, now struck at its very heart.
It was some way to celebrate your 40th year on the throne.
1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis.
What should have been a happy occasion, 40 years on the throne, was an awful year for the Queen. 3 of her 4 children's marriages were on the rocks, and her favourite royal residence had just been completely destroyed. You can hardly blame her for calling it an annus horribilis.
If 1992 was the annus horribilis, things were about to get even more horrible. Another intimate phone call is leaked, this time between Charles and Camilla.
A tape was recorded and leaked of their private conversation, pillow talk, between Charles and Camilla.
The press had a field day. I mean, headline after headline, negative headline after headline, massive support for Princess Diana, almost a hate campaign towards Camilla.
This is a couple who is speaking extremely intimately, at a level that friends don't talk.
Charles was not that popular anyway, but his popularity just plummeted when the headlines hit.
It is now clear that Camilla is far more than a friend. And in June 1994, Charles agrees to an interview with the broadcasting giant, Jonathan Dimbleby.
When Charles admitted to adultery, I think that is perhaps the most scandalous moment in modern royal history, because here was a future king admitting that he had cheated on his wife. I mean, people really did begin to discuss whether he was fit to be king.
Camilla finds herself thrust into the spotlight as the other woman.
She had photographers outside her house. She couldn't move for journalists. And I think the narrative was very much on Diana's side.
Some might have even said Camilla's now the most hated woman on the planet.
There were people on the streets wagging their fingers at her and saying, you know, you have wrecked the royal family.
The affair left Camilla vulnerable and really, really loathed.
In November 1995, 18 months after Charles's TV interview, Diana agrees to speak to the BBC. It causes a sensation.
The Panorama interview with Diana sent shockwaves throughout the royal family, talking about there were 3 people in the marriage.
It's a very clever line, very, very memorable. That phrase, "there were 3 of us in this marriage," from the Martin Bashir interview, sealed the deal.
I think that was a huge issue for Charles. I mean, people really did begin to discuss whether he was fit to be king, whether the monarchy at large was in danger.
There was definitely talk of abdication. I think the public were so angry at Charles and Camilla.
The methods of gaining that interview have now been discredited, but the impact from Diana's point of view felt like game, set, and match. By now, the Queen has had enough.
The Queen, at first, wanted to try to make the marriage between Charles and Diana work. Remember, it's the Queen. She doesn't like divorce. However, things changed. Diana did a Panorama interview, and that is when the Queen stepped in and said, enough is enough.
Good evening. The Princess of Wales announced tonight that she's agreed to a divorce, and so gave up any prospect of becoming Queen.
Charles and Diana's divorce is finalised in August 1996. Camilla had been granted her divorce the previous year, but she is still seen as the enemy.
Camilla was reviled by the press and the public, and you know, she's a pretty private woman. Found herself caught up in this mess, blamed for this mess, I think unfairly. But the 90s were not a good time for her.
But as the months go on and talk of a constitutional crisis abates, Charles may have begun to hope that he could eventually make Camilla part of his public life. But that is about to change. In August 1997, a year after the divorce is finalised, devastating news comes from Paris.
No one could ever have predicted what happened to Princess Diana.
The Press Association announced with a news flash at 4:41, that's just a few minutes ago, that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died.
I remember the death of Princess Diana extremely clearly because I was in my teens. And there was just absolute silence in London. on that day.
She was so young, so glamorous. How could someone so vibrant be just snuffed out like that? It was just completely incomprehensible.
It's 1997. Charles and Diana have been divorced for just over a year. The princess reportedly tells friends they're getting on better than ever. As one of the most beautiful women in the world, there's no shortage of admirers for Diana. As for Charles, comforted by Camilla, he continues his public duties. But then comes news that shocks the world.
The Press Association announced with a news flash at 4:41, that's just a few minutes ago, that Diana, Princess of Wales, has died.
I remember waking up on that Sunday morning and seeing and hearing the headlines. Everyone was in complete shock, which I think it goes a long way to explaining how the royal family behaved in that week afterwards. They came under a lot of criticism for staying up in Scotland, for not raising the flag, all that kind of thing. But they didn't know how to behave. No one knew how to behave because William and Harry's mother had just been killed in the most awful circumstances.
After Diana's tragic death in 1997, the world stopped, and in that moment, the monarchy stopped as well. And Charles had a real huge issue on his hands, not to only just take care of his children, who were devastated by the loss of their mother, but what did it mean for him?
The death of the princess leads to an outpouring of grief, and along with the grief comes anger.
I covered the funeral of Princess Diana, and we all know there are various stages of grief. Anger is definitely part of that, and the level of upset and also anger towards the Queen for not flying the flag at half-mast, and of course the paparazzi and the press as well. But the level of anger was something we haven't seen in this country for a long time, and a lot of it was directed at Charles and Camilla.
I disapprove of the way Charles and Camilla treated Diana. It was despicable.
The public were so angry at Charles and Camilla, and of course there's this enormous outpouring of love towards Diana. So the question on everybody's mind was, what's going to happen now?
Charles was genuinely worried there would be an assassination attempt during that funeral procession. Camilla was seen as the Wicked Witch of the West Country, and I think unfairly blamed for the whole mess.
The monarchy weathers the storm, but the tragedy seems to end all hopes of Charles and Camilla having a public life together. Charles concentrates on bringing up his children as a single father.
William was only 15 when Diana died. Harry obviously was younger, so this is a really crucial part of anybody's life.
Charles, now a single dad, really stepped into that role, I think, quite in an extraordinary way, and more so than I think anybody ever thought he would.
Charles has always tried to do his best. If you believe everything in Harry's book, it can be quite a cold relationship. They undoubtedly love one another, but they're not tactile in the way that Diana and Harry and Diana and William were.
Oh. What? No, I wouldn't do that.
But as years pass and Charles deals with the burdens of state, he needs the help and support of the woman he loves. He's determined to have Camilla alongside him.
There had to be a pathway for Camilla. Charles said that Camilla was absolutely non-negotiable, and he's stuck to that.
Charles knows the road won't be easy, but they're ready for the fight.
Charles and Camilla are an extremely strong couple. They have known each other for 50+ years.
She's had to ignore what people were saying about her, whether that was the British media or whether that was people wagging their finger at her.
Camilla's emergence into public life will take more than resilience. It will take time.
It was a slow return to public for Camilla. She very much minded what foot she put forward and when she decided to stay back. And they have done a remarkable job in rebranding, if you like, Queen Consort Camilla.
On a cold January evening in 1990, make her first public appearance by Charles's side.
Within 2 years of Diana's death, there was the first big public moment of Charles and Camilla being pictured together.
Operation Ritz is a huge success, and the following year, there's another landmark moment. In June 2000, the Queen meets Camilla at Charles's London home, Highgrove.
Charles threw a big 60th birthday party for the exiled King of Greece, King Constantine. This was a private party, it wasn't publicised, but word eventually leaked out that Camilla was there by Charles's side and the Queen went. And it was a really important show of approval.
For Charles and Camilla, it is a milestone. The heir to the throne's long-term companion, now accepted in royal circles.
The Queen going to this birthday party was a definite show of support for Charles and his partner.
The meeting with the Queen is a significant turning point, but 5 more years of public service follow before Charles and Camilla take the next step and announce their engagement.
There was definitely a deliberate campaign, we can call it Operation PB for Parker Bowles, on the side of Camilla's press office to rehabilitate her. She was deliberately kept out of very glamorous appearances. She was genuinely, truly working for approval.
Camilla's tireless charity work will win her many new admirers over the coming years, and few today doubt its sincerity.
I've been really impressed on her work with victims of domestic violence and sexual violence. Whenever I'm on a royal tour with her, she wants to go and meet victims of sexual violence, and often the cameras can't be there because you can't film those kinds of things. It's too sensitive. So it's not for PR purposes, she does it because she really cares.
Finally, in February 2005, Charles pops the question.
How are you feeling, ma'am?
All right.
Just all right?
I'm just coming down to earth.
Did you get down on one knee to propose?
Of course.
I'd like to propose a toast to the happy couple.
The public has definitely rallied around Charles. They have rallied around Camilla.
To Charles and Camilla, our future king and queen. Good luck, good health, and may God bless you both.
Camilla has worked incredibly hard to make sure that she would be accepted.
Charles and Camilla tie them
has not been smooth. They have had to wait decades before they could stand next to each other as husband and wife.
And I think public attitudes did soften. Time is a great healer. I think most people wanted Charles to be happy, and they could see how happy they were together as a couple. So the wedding in 2005 was a jolly one, and William and Harry were front and centre there, sending their dad on his way.
As the crowds cheer the newly married couple, the Queen too is on hand to give her blessing.
The Queen did a really nice speech at the reception, which was in Windsor Castle, saying it was the day of the Grand National. Camilla's a massive racing fan, as is the Queen, and the Queen used lots of kind of racing terminology, saying that the couple had gone over Beecher's Brook and were finally in the kind of, the final straight, and they've reached the finishing line, and they were, everyone was applauding them. And then the Queen very quickly nipped off to go and watch the Grand National in a side room once she'd done the speech, because she had a bet on some of the horses.
With the wedding of Charles and Camilla, 2 families become one in a very modern way.
I think in many ways, Charles and Camilla, because of their blended family, it makes them more representative of 21st century Britain than Charles's marriage to a young aristocrat who, was a virgin, and that is from another life. They've got step-grandchildren and stepchildren. They're more representative of the 21st century, where divorce is not, a murder anymore. It's something that many, many people go through.
But life in a blended family can throw up a few challenges, not least for the new princess consort.
Camilla's relationship with the princes will always be tricky and ambiguous. She's not just the second wife. She is the other woman who was around when the first wife was around.
They were in support of the relationship. They wanted their father to be happy. They could see that Camilla did make him happy, but they were still obviously hugely loyal to their mother and her legacy.
As the years roll by, Camilla proves adept at negotiating existing family relationships and building new ones.
She and Kate visibly get on. You can see that whenever they see each other. There's a warmth there between the two women. And Kate, in turn, has improved the relationship between both William and his father and William and his stepmother.
Fast forward to 2022. The Queen signals her support for Camilla by giving her a new title.
We had that unprecedented statement out of the blue for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee that the late Queen said it was her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort.
But she soon finds herself in the firing line in yet another royal row.
Harry made extremely negative comments about Camilla in Spare. He called her the other woman.
No institution is immune to accountability or taking responsibility.
Charles and Camilla absolutely would have been, and probably still are, disappointed and incredibly hurt.
For Charles and Camilla, the course of true love has not run smooth. But now, after 50 years of ups and downs, she takes his side at the coronation.
Her transformation is complete, from mistress to queen. But this is never what Camilla set out to do. Camilla never wanted to be queen. That was never her intention. She just happened to fall in love with the heir to the British throne.
Well, certainly at one time, even 20 to 25 years ago, it would have been completely unthinkable to have a Queen Camilla.
If you remember how she was viewed in the late 90s compared to now, that's quite a shift.
To some, the secret is simple: hard work and good causes.
Camilla has used the platform that she has now married into for, of course, wonderful charity work.
She's rolled her sleeves up, she's got on with the job, she's really tapped into what being a royal involves.
In particular, she's a champion of literacy and also charitable work in osteoporosis, because that is what her mother suffered from.
I think that's really stood her in good stead. People have seen that she really takes these issues seriously and is using her platform for the greater good.
Alongside her dedication to public service is her devotion to her husband.
Charles and Camilla is one of the great, enduring, unlikely love affairs of all time.
They are very good together. She makes him laugh.
The king is much more relaxed when she's around at engagements, when she's there to support him.
Whenever they're in public together, they're commenting to each other and they're grinning and joking and laughing.
She's fun, she's warm, she's a great people person. I've seen her quietly work a room.
And she grounds him, she tells him when he's being too grand. He uses her as a sounding board. I mean, yeah, it is. They've been in love with each other for 50 years.
I feel a little bit jealous, a little bit.
And a sense of humour comes in handy when marrying into the firm, where a new drama is never too far away.
The late Duke of Edinburgh complained that they've been turned into a soap opera. He swore a bit in that phrase. And there's an element of truth in that.
When Prince Harry married Meghan Markle in 2018, it looks set to catapult the Windsors into the 21st century.
I think Camilla did welcome Meghan into the royal family because she was an outsider. She knew what it was like to be, you know, looking from the outside in. And this is a very difficult family to get along with and to work for at the best of times. And Meghan would have needed all the help she could have got.
Megxit would prove another painful episode for the royals. And when Harry published his controversial memoirs, he didn't spare his stepmom's feelings.
He called her the other woman. He said that she was briefing and leaking against him.
Harry definitely makes a beeline for Camilla, saying that the PR campaign is a lot more calculated than anybody else realises.
He said that he tried to get an intimate conversation with her, person to person, but that elements of private conversations would then work their way into their tabloids.
She is definitely one of the main targets in the book, and that's Harry's view, but we can't give you a second source on that.
Harry doubled down on his criticism in his interview with ITN's Tom Bradby.
There's no part of any of the things that I've said are scathing towards any member of my family, especially not my stepmother. No institution is immune to accountability or taking responsibility. So you can't be immune to criticisms either.
Criticism's one thing Camilla's got used to over the years, but not always from within the family.
Charles and Camilla absolutely would have been, and probably still are, disappointed and incredibly hurt.
Perhaps the biggest challenge facing Camilla came in September 2022.
The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon.
The new king pays tribute to his mother.
She set an example of selfless duty, which, with God's help and your counsels, I am resolved faithfully to follow.
As the nation mourns the death of the Queen, Camilla comforts her husband.
After the late Queen's passing, Camilla really did support Charles. Of course, she was by his side in the key moments, the preparation for his speech to the nation in the aftermath of his mother's death.
If you watch footage of the end of the Queen's funeral, it's very hard on Charles. You can see how tired he is, and you can see Camilla really being very strong, standing there. She's the only person that Charles really has.
It was one of the Queen's last wishes that Camilla be known by a new title.
For Her Late Majesty, the Queen, to actually intervene and put out a statement to say that it is her wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when the time comes is huge.
It was a PR masterstroke. At a stroke, that neutered any potential opposition because Queen Elizabeth was so loved. It was no surprise to me that on the coronation invitations, it says King Charles and Queen Camilla. At their coronation, they'll be crowned as King Charles and Queen Camilla.
The coronation marks the start of a new era for this old institution and a new chapter in this enduring love story.
The relationship has flourished against all odds. They suit each other very well.
Charles and Camilla are very much in love. They have same interests, same hobbies, same passions. And I know that Charles and Camilla will do a brilliant job in their roles as king and queen.
They both married the right/wrong person first time round, but then they found each other again. And I think you'd have to be the hardest of cynics not to recognise it for the love story that it is.